2,500 guilders. That is what the Dutch government spent to build 1 hectare of farmland out of open sea. Not to buy it, to make it. The figure comes from a note the government laid before its own parliament in the 1930s, costing a new polder before a single spade went in. 48,000 hectares of new land at 2,500 guilders each. Most people picture reclaimed land as a gift, as free ground the sea handed back. It was the most expensive farmland the country ever made. This is the economics of building new land. And the bill did not stop when the water did. Start with what that sentence actually means. The Netherlands manufactured this land. Engineers took a shallow arm of the North Sea, walled it off, pumped it dry, and turned the seabed into fields. A patch of drained seabed like that has a name. It is called a polder. The largest single stretch of this new land is the province the Dutch now call Flevoland. One thing to say plainly before we go on, the cleanest cost records in this story do not come from Flevoland itself. They come from 2 older polders built earlier in the same project. So when the numbers get specific, they are the numbers for those polders. Flevoland is where the method ended up, not where the accounting is clearest. We will use the figures that actually survive. Hold on to one idea because everything else hangs off it. New land keeps costing money long after it is finished. It started with a flood. In the winter of 1916, a storm drove the sea over the dikes around the Zuiderzee, the shallow bay in the middle of the country. The water had swallowed this coast many times over the centuries. This time, the government finally acted. The plan it reached for was already decades old. An engineer named Cornelis Lely had drawn it up back in 1891, and it had sat mostly unused ever since, close off the bay with one enormous dam, then drain the water behind the dam piece by piece and farm what was left. In 1918, Parliament passed the law and committed to Lely's plan. They were not even sure the soil would be any good. Before committing, the engineers drained a tiny test polder, less than half a square kilometer, just to watch what the old seabed would do once it dried. Only then did the real work begin. The dam came first. They called it the Afsluitdijk, the enclosing dam. Work ran from 1927 to 1932. It was 32 kilometers of rock and clay laid straight across open tidal water. The hardest part was the last gap. There, the crews had to drop fill faster than the tide could wash it away. On the 28th of May, 1932, they closed it. The bay stopped being sea the moment they did. The salt water behind the dam was now cut off from the tides. The rivers slowly flushed it, and it turned fresh. The Zuiderzee was gone. In its place was a lake, the IJsselmeer. But the dam was the easy half. Sealing the water off did not make a single field. It only set the stage for the expensive part. This is the kind of story this channel is built for, the economics behind the things most people only ever see finished. If that is what you came for, subscribe and the next one will find you. So what did it cost to turn that lake bottom into farmland? For once, we have a real answer written down at the time. When the government planned the first big polder inside the new lake, the northern one, it put a note before Parliament. The note set a target. Every hectare of new land was to cost no more than 2,500 guilders all in. That figure covered everything, building the ring dike, pumping the water out, and then years of slow work on the bare seabed before it could grow a proper crop. 2,500 guilders a hectare. It is hard to say what that is worth in today's money, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. The guilder of the 1930s was gold-backed, then devalued that same decade. Any modern figure would be a guess dressed up as a fact, so measure it inside its own time instead. A standard family farm on the new land was 24 hectares. At that rate, the state spent about 60,000 guilders just to build the land under one farm. That was before the family leasing it planted a thing. And it did not build one farm. It built around 1,500 of them. Added up across the whole polder, and the government's own estimate came to over 126 million guilders, 48,000 hectares of made land, at a price it wrote down before it began. And the phrase grow a proper crop is doing a lot of quiet work in that estimate. When a polder first came dry, it was bare marine clay, still soaked with sea salt. It could not grow anything worth selling. So the state farmed it first, on its own account. It sowed hardy pioneer crops that pulled the salt up out of the ground. It laced the fields with clay drainage pipe, roughly 40,000 kilometers of it, buried under the new land. This went on for years before a single tenant moved in. At its peak in 1949, the government was farming more than 32,000 hectares of that northern polder itself, as one giant state enterprise, purely to get the ground ready to hand over. So the price did not just buy a dike and a pump. It bought years of farming the land before the land could pay anyone back. Then there is what happened once the land was ready. The state did not sell these farms. It leased them to hand-picked tenant farmers, and it set the rents deliberately low, well under what the open market would have charged. For decades, that was seen as the healthy way to run the new land. It also meant the government was never going to earn its 126 million guilders back quickly through rent. It had built a national asset and then rented it out cheap on purpose. Now the part that matters most for the economics. Getting the water out was only the beginning of the spending. The larger costs came afterward, in keeping the land dry and making it farmable. This land sits below the sea. Parts of it lie as much as 7 meters under the water outside the dikes. Water does not run off it. Water runs into it, every day, seeping under the dikes and falling as rain. If the pumps ever stop, the sea quietly takes it all back. So the pumps never stop. In that northern polder alone, the drainage stations are built to move around 7 million cubic meters of water a day. That is not a one-time cost. That bill arrives every single day, for as long as the land is meant to stay dry. New land does not just cost money to build, it costs money to keep. The land only stays land for as long as someone keeps paying to pump it. And they did not build one polder, they built 4. The first came dry in 1930, the northern one, the one with the price tag, in 1942. Then 2 more, the pieces that make up most of Flevoland, in 1957 and 1967. Together, they turned roughly 165,000 hectares of seabed into land, over almost 40 years of digging and pumping. Every hectare of it was expensive to make and expensive to hold, and one of the 4 was about to show how fast it could all be lost. The first polder, the one drained in 1930, was the showpiece. 20,000 hectares of new farmland, 4 villages. Around 7,000 people were living on ground that had been open water just 15 years before. Some were farming families, others were people hiding out there through the war. Then came April 1945. The war in the Netherlands was almost over. German forces were retreating, and on the 17th, they blew a gap in the dike that held the sea out of that polder in 2 places. Fresh water from the lake poured back in, almost 700 million cubic meters of it. Within 2 days, the whole polder was underwater again. 70 to 80% of the buildings were destroyed. 400 farms and 1,000 houses gone. The entire standing crop lost. The people had been warned and got out, so almost nobody died. But 15 years of building was undone in 48 hours. Put a number on what went under. We do not have a clean per hectare cost for that older polder. So take the later polder's own accounting, that same benchmark of 2,500 guilders a hectare, as a fair measure of what this kind of land costs to build. 20,000 hectares at that rate is on the order of 50 million guilders of made land, sitting behind one dike. 2 days of war put it back under the sea. So one question before we go on. If that bill were yours, would you pay to build the very same land a second time? Tell me in the comments. But watch what the Dutch did next, because it shows exactly how they valued made land. They drained it again, straight away. There was never any real question about whether to do it. It helped that the water was fresh, not salt, so the ground did not have to be leached all over again. By December of that same year, only 8 months after the flood, the pumps had the polder dry a second time. Rebuilding every farm, road, and village on it ran on for about 5 more years, handled as a national reconstruction job. The state paid, in effect, to build the same 20,000 hectares twice. To a country that manufactures its own ground, letting the sea keep that land was simply the more expensive choice. And that is the whole story of this land in one flood. It was expensive to make and then expensive to keep dry every year after. When the sea took it back, the Dutch spent 5 years making it again, because leaving it drowned would have cost them even more. The families came back, and by the early 1950s, the polder looked much as it had before the war. Every one of those 4 polders carries the same permanent bill. The 1945 flood just made that bill visible for 2 years, which brings us back to the man who started it. Cornelis Lely drew the plan in 1891 and spent his career pushing it through Parliament. He did not live to see it work. Lely died in 1929 at his desk, 3 years before the crews closed the dam that was his idea. He died before the first polder was even drained. The new capital city, out on that reclaimed ground, carries his name anyway, Lelystad, a city sitting where ships used to sail. His plan called for 5 polders. The Dutch built 4 of them. The 5th was surveyed, costed, and drawn on the maps for decades. Engineers kept the plans alive into the 1990s, waiting for the go-ahead. But it was never built. They could have built it. They chose not to because by the time they were ready, the reason for the whole project had quietly disappeared. Dutch farms had learned to grow so much more on each hectare that the country simply did not need the extra farmland anymore. 60 years of manufacturing ground had ended with a nation that had land to spare. The most expensive land-making machine ever built had made itself unnecessary. So the sea kept the last polder, and the map still shows a stretch of open water where Lely had drawn a field. Step back and look at the whole ledger. 165,000 hectares of land lifted out of the sea. Every hectare of it still pumped dry today, decade after decade, at the country's own expense. That is the real economics of building new land. The dam is the part everyone remembers. It was also the cheapest part of the whole project. The lasting cost was the bill that kept arriving year after year. And in the end, the Dutch left one last field underwater because draining it was no longer worth the money.